The sky over Butler County, Iowa, on the afternoon of May 25, 2008 held a strange, heavy stillness. It was a Sunday, a day usually marked by the slow hum of lawnmowers and the distant clatter of church bells releasing their congregations into the warm spring air. But this Sunday felt different. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and the typical Midwestern breeze had died to nothing. The heat pressed down like a weight. Those who had lived in Iowa all their lives knew the signs. They had grown up watching the horizon, reading the sky the way a sailor reads the sea. And what they read on that afternoon was not good. The calm was a mask. Beneath it, the atmosphere was winding itself into a coil of terrible energy. To understand what was about to happen, you have to understand the geography of that part of Iowa. Parkersburg and New Hartford are small towns, the kind where everybody knows everybody, where the main street is a single strip of businesses that have been there for decades, where kids ride their bikes to the corner store and wave at the postmaster. Parkersburg, in particular, was a community built on hard work and cornfields. The town had just over 2,000 people. The grain elevator rose against the sky like a stone sentinel. There were churches, a school, a few blocks of tidy houses with big porches. It was the kind of place that felt safe, not because of walls or locks, but because of the simple fact that nothing terrible had ever happened there. The worst thing most people could remember was a bad blizzard or a hailstorm that dented a few cars. Tornadoes were something you saw on the news coming out of Oklahoma or Kansas, not something that tore through your own backyard. But the conditions on that Sunday were aligning for a nightmare. A powerful low-pressure system was sweeping across the plains. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico was being pulled northward, colliding with a cold front dropping down from Canada. The clash was violent. By early afternoon, the Storm Prediction Center had issued a moderate risk for severe weather across northern Iowa. That was the official language. But the Weather Service offices in Des Moines and Sioux Falls were growing more and more worried. The computer models were showing something worse than moderate. They were showing a setup that usually preceded the worst kind of tornado, the kind that stays on the ground for miles, the kind that does not skip or jump but instead grinds across the earth like a blade. At around 3:30 p.m., the first warnings went out. A severe thunderstorm had formed over eastern Nebraska and was moving into Iowa. It intensified rapidly. In the town of Aplington, just a few miles west of Parkersburg, people noticed the sky turning a deep, sickly green. That green is a color no Iowan forgets. It means hail, it means power, it means the atmosphere is filled with ice and electricity and the potential for unimaginable violence. The storm began to rotate. Meteorologists in the Des Moines office watched the radar with a growing sense of dread. The hook echo, the classic signature of a tornado on radar, was becoming more defined. It was tightening. It was aiming straight at Parkersburg. Inside the homes of Parkersburg, the afternoon passed in a strange mix of routine and unease. Some people had their televisions on. Others were outside, working in the yard or finishing up chores. Many had attended morning church services and had spent the afternoon with family. A few were hosting barbecues. The first siren did not sound until after 4:30 p.m. That siren was not the familiar weekly test. It was a wail, long and rising. It cut through the stillness like a blade. Those who heard it felt a cold spike of adrenaline. They grabbed children, pets, anything precious and headed for basements, closets, bathtubs. They did not know it yet, but they had only minutes. The tornado touched down at approximately 4:43 p.m., just west of Parkersburg, near the intersection of 290th Street and V Avenue. The National Weather Service would later classify it as an EF5, the highest rating on the enhanced Fujita scale. That rating is reserved for storms that produce winds over 200 miles per hour. An EF5 tornado is not just a wind event, it is a force of nature that defies description. It can lift a house off its foundation and scatter it across a field. It can peel asphalt from a road. It can drive a 2x4 through a concrete wall. It does not discriminate. It does not care about history or family or the pictures on the mantle. It only destroys. The tornado was about 3/4 of a mile wide when it hit the edge of Parkersburg. That is nearly 4,000 feet of rotating destruction. Its color was not the classic black of a funnel cloud. This one was brown and gray, filled with dirt and debris and pieces of people's lives. The roar was unlike anything survivors would later describe. It was not the whistle of a train, though that is a common comparison. It was more like a deep, grinding thunder that never stopped. It was a sound that came from the ground and the sky at the same time. Some said it was like standing next to a jet engine. Others said it was like the whole world was being torn apart and the sound was just the screaming of the air itself. In the first few seconds of its passage through town, the tornado obliterated the western neighborhoods. One home after another simply vanished. The frames splintered. The roofs were ripped off and carried away like paper. The walls collapsed. The debris did not just fall, it was shot through the air at speeds that could kill instantly. A piece of plywood could become a guillotine. A shard of glass could embed itself in a tree trunk. Cars were tossed into the air, some of them landing upside down in fields hundreds of yards away. The Parkersburg grain elevator, that massive concrete structure that had stood for decades, was hit and partially collapsed. The steel bins that held thousands of bushels of corn were crumpled like foil. The entire industrial edge of the town was flattened. One of the most heartbreaking stories to come out of the first moments of the tornado was that of the Parkersburg School. The elementary school, a brick building that sat in the path of the storm, was struck. Fortunately, it was a Sunday and the building was empty except for a custodian who took cover in a janitor's closet. He survived. But the school itself was ruined, its roof gone, its walls buckled, its classrooms filled with broken glass and soaked with rain. The playground equipment was twisted into knots. The school bus, parked nearby, was rolled onto its side. It would be weeks before the community could even think about rebuilding. That school had been the heart of the town. It was where children learned to read, where parents attended parent-teacher conferences, where the whole town gathered for concerts and plays. And now it was a wreck, but the tornado did not stop. It plowed through the center of Parkersburg, cutting a swath that was nearly a mile wide in places. The downtown area with its small businesses and historic buildings took a direct hit. The Parkersburg Opera House, a beloved landmark built in the late 1800s, was destroyed. The city hall was damaged. The fire station lost its doors and had to be evacuated. Many of the homes along the main street were so completely leveled that their foundations looked like empty lots. The iron and steel of the town water tower was buckled. The town's water system was compromised. In the moments after the tornado passed, there was no power, no water, no phone lines. The only sound was the wind dying down and the first cries from the survivors. In a two-story house on the corner of 5th Street and Elm, a family of 5 huddled in the basement. The father, a farmer named Harold, had heard the siren and had rushed his wife and 3 children down the narrow stairs. They had just seconds to spare. The house above them groaned and then seemed to lift. Harold pushed his family against the concrete wall, covering his youngest daughter with his body. He could hear the roar, but he could also feel the pressure change. His ears popped, the air grew thin, dust choked his throat. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the roar faded, replaced by a strange quiet. Harold looked up. The basement ceiling was gone. He could see the gray, churning sky. The entire upper floor of his house had been ripped off. When he climbed out through the debris, he saw that his home was now just a single cinderblock basement with a ragged stump of wall. The rest was scattered across the neighborhood. Across town, an elderly woman named Martha had no basement. She lived in a small ranch home with only a crawl space. When the siren sounded, she did what her neighbors had always told her to do for a tornado. She got into her bathtub and pulled a mattress over herself. It was a common piece of advice, though not always sufficient for an EF5. Martha listened to the storm as it approached. The windows exploded inward. The walls of her bathroom began to shake. She felt the bathtub shift beneath her. The mattress was torn away. Then something heavy struck her shoulder and she lost consciousness. When she woke, she was lying in the open air in what had been her living room. The bathtub was still under her, but the house around her was gone. Her shoulder was broken and she was covered in cuts and bruises, but she was alive. Her neighbors found her and carried her to a makeshift triage center set up in a garage that had somehow remained standing. The tornado spent about 7 minutes inside the Parkersville city limits. 7 minutes? That is barely long enough to boil an egg or sing one verse of a hymn. But in those 7 minutes, the tornado destroyed more than half the homes in the town. The official count would later be 225 homes completely destroyed and another 400 severely damaged. But numbers are cold. The real story was in the faces of the people who emerged from their shelters to find a world they did not recognize. Streets were gone. The familiar landmarks were either missing or reduced to piles of rubble. The smell was a mix of wet wood, natural gas, and something else, something that was the smell of a community ripped apart. One of the first responders on the scene was a volunteer firefighter named Ryan. He had been at his home in a neighboring town when he heard the call. He drove toward Parkersburg as fast as he could, but he had to stop his truck several times because the road was blocked by debris. When he finally reached the edge of town, he parked and started walking. The first thing he saw was a child's bicycle twisted into a hoop. The second thing he saw was a man standing in his driveway staring at a spot where his garage used to be. The man was clutching a photograph. He did not say anything. Ryan walked up to him and asked if he was okay. The man just nodded, but he did not look at Ryan. He kept staring at that photograph as if trying to remember something. Ryan later said that was the moment he understood that the tornado had taken more than houses. It had taken a sense of place. It had taken the ordinary assumptions of safety that people carry with them every day. As the sun began to set on May 25, 2008, the full scope of the disaster was still unclear. Rescue workers were pulling people from collapsed basements. Dogs were being used to sniff for survivors. The Red Cross was setting up shelters in nearby towns. Governor Chet Culver had declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was mobilizing, but for the people of Parkersburg, all of that was background noise. What mattered was finding the missing, and there were missing. The tornado had killed 7 people in Parkersburg. 7 people who had gone to church that morning, or who had been putting gas in their cars, or who had been watching the weather on television. Their families would never see them again. One of the victims was a 50-year-old man named Larry who had been driving home from a hardware store. His truck was found in a field upside down. He was still inside. Another victim was a mother of 2, Jenny, who had been at a friend's house. She had tried to get to her car to go home and check on her children, but she never made it. Her children, who had been hiding in their own basement with their father, survived. The father had to be told by a neighbor that his wife was gone. He did not believe it at first. He insisted that she must have been taken to a hospital somewhere, but the hospitals in the area did not have her. The only place she was among the debris. The tornado did not stop after Parkersburg. It continued northeast, carving a path through the countryside, demolishing farms, flattening barns, snapping power poles like toothpicks. It was moving at about 45 miles per hour, which is fast for a tornado. That speed meant that people in its path had very little warning. In the town of New Hartford, about 10 miles northeast of Parkersburg, the storm arrived just a few minutes after it had left the first town. New Hartford was smaller, with about 600 residents. The tornado had weakened slightly, but it was still a powerful EF3 with winds over 160 miles per hour. It struck the town with the same brutal efficiency. 7 more people died in New Hartford. Among them was an elderly couple, John and Alina, who had been married for 54 years. They were found in the rubble of their home, holding hands. The storm finally dissipated near the town of Dunkerton, about 30 miles from where it had first touched down. By the time it was over, the tornado had been on the ground for 43 miles. 43 miles of destruction. The total death toll was 9 people, including a man in his 80s who died later from injuries. Over 70 people were injured. The property damage was estimated at over $100 million, but in the immediate aftermath, no one was thinking about dollars. They were thinking about survival. They were thinking about the people they had lost. They were thinking about how to rebuild a life from a pile of splinters. As night fell, the rescue efforts turned into a search for bodies. The power was out across the entire region. The only light came from emergency vehicles and the moon, which was a thin crescent. The air was cool and damp. The silence when it came was worse than the roar. It was the silence of a town that had been knocked breathless. People walked through the dark, calling out the names of their neighbors. Some answers came back, some did not. This is where the story of the Parkersburg-New Hartford tornado begins. It begins with a quiet Sunday, a green sky, and a roar that changed everything. It begins with the survivors and the dead. It begins with a community that had to learn in the span of 7 minutes that everything they thought they knew about safety was wrong. But it also begins with something else, the determination to stand back up. That is the part of the story that would unfold in the days and months and years to come. That is the part that would test the very meaning of the word community. But all of that was still in the future. On the night of May 25, 2008, the only thing that existed was the wreckage and the resolve to find anyone who was still alive. That night, the survivors did not sleep. They could not sleep. The adrenaline was still pumping through their veins, and every creak of the wind, every distant groan of metal shifting sent a fresh jolt of fear through their bodies. In the makeshift shelters set up in the surviving churches and schools, people sat on cots and folding chairs, staring at nothing. Some held hands, some cried, some simply stared at the floor, trying to process what had happened. The children, for the most part, were quiet. They had seen things that no child should see. They had heard sounds that no child should hear. And they had learned in the span of a few minutes that the world could turn upside down without warning. By midnight, the rescue teams had switched from active search to careful recovery. The dogs had been through every pile of rubble that looked like it might contain a body. The results were grim. In Parkersburg, the confirmed death count had risen to 7. In New Hartford, it was 7 as well, though 2 of those would later be reclassified as critical injuries that led to death days later. The total number of missing was still unclear because communication was nearly impossible. Cell towers were down, landlines were dead. The only way to get information was face-to-face, and that meant walking through the dark, stepping over splintered boards and shattered glass, calling out names into the silence. One of the search volunteers was a high school teacher named David. He had been at a church service when the tornado hit, and his church had been spared. His home, however, had been destroyed. He spent the first few hours after the storm helping to dig out his neighbors. Then he joined the official search teams. He was assigned to a quadrant near the center of town where the damage was absolute. He walked through what had once been a neighborhood of modest ranch homes and split levels. Now it looked like a field of broken matchsticks. He saw a refrigerator lying on its side, its door ripped off. He saw a sofa perched on top of a car. He saw a child's doll still holding a tiny plastic bottle lying in the middle of a street that was now just a strip of gravel. He picked up the doll and held it for a moment. Then he placed it on the curb next to a pile of rubble that might have been a house. He did not know why he did that, it just felt wrong to leave it in the road. At about 2 in the morning, David came across a woman who was sitting on a section of concrete foundation. She was holding a small black and white photograph of a man in a military uniform. The woman looked up at David and said, "This is my husband. He died in Vietnam. I saved this picture from the fire in 198 and now I've saved it again. I don't know why I keep saving it when everything else is gone." David sat down next to her and listened. She told him about her house, about the porcelain dolls she had collected for 40 years, about the garden she had planted every spring. She told him about her son who lived in Des Moines and was trying to drive down to find her, but the roads were blocked. She told him that she was 72 years old and that she had never been so afraid in her life. David stayed with her until a paramedic came to take her to a shelter. As she walked away, she clutched the photograph to her chest. David watched her go and then he continued his search. The next morning, the sun rose on a landscape that looked like a war zone. The first light revealed the full extent of the destruction. In Parkersburg, the high school was a pile of rubble. The elementary school was gone. The town hall was a skeleton. The grain elevator, which had stood for over a century, was twisted into a metal pretzel. Trees that had lined the streets for decades were uprooted or snapped cleanly in half. Cars were stacked on top of each other like toys. The smell of natural gas was overwhelming, and crews from the utility company were working frantically to shut off the lines before a spark caused another disaster. Governor Culver arrived by helicopter in the late morning. He walked through the streets with the mayor and the head of the Iowa Homeland Security Office. He did not give a speech. He simply looked at the damage and listened to the stories. He saw a man digging through the rubble of his home with his bare hands looking for his cat. He saw a woman standing in a field that had been her backyard, holding a single unbroken teacup. He saw a group of teenagers carrying bags of food and water from a pickup truck that had somehow survived. The governor later said that the people of Parkersburg had the same look in their eyes that he had seen after the floods of 1993, a look of shock mixed with a stubborn determination to survive. The federal government moved quickly. President George W. Bush declared a major disaster for the counties of Butler and Bremer, making federal funding available for individual assistance and public infrastructure repairs. FEMA teams arrived within days, setting up trailers and tents near the outskirts of town. They brought mobile homes for those who had lost everything, but the demand far exceeded the supply. Many families ended up staying with relatives in nearby towns or sleeping in the back of their cars. The Red Cross set up a temporary shelter in the gymnasium of a school in a neighboring district. That shelter housed over 300 people in the first week. Volunteers came from all over the state. Churches sent vans full of clothes and canned goods. The Salvation Army served hot meals every evening. Local restaurants that had survived donated food. Farmers brought in hay for the livestock that had survived. It was in many ways a flood of kindness washing over a town that had been scoured by wind, but the emotional toll was immense. The survivors had to deal not only with the loss of their homes but also with the loss of their routines, their neighbors, their sense of normalcy. The smell of debris, the sound of generators, the constant presence of strangers in hard hats, all of it reminded them that their world had been broken. And then there were the funerals. The first funeral was held on Wednesday, May 28th, for a man named Harold who had been 68 years old and had owned the local hardware store. He had been in his shop when the tornado hit and the building had collapsed on him. His wife had been at home and she had survived by hiding in a closet. She came to the funeral in a borrowed dress. She had lost everything, including the clothes on her back, but she had found her wedding ring in the rubble 2 days after the storm. She wore it to the funeral and she held it out for everyone to see. "He gave me this ring 50 years ago," she said, "and I'm not going to stop wearing it now." The funerals continued for 2 weeks. Some were small, with only a dozen people in attendance. Others were large, with hundreds of mourners standing outside the church because there was no room inside. The stories of the victims were told over and over again. There was the young couple who had just bought their first home 3 months before the tornado. There was the grandmother who had been babysitting her granddaughter when the storm hit. Both of them died. There was the teenager who had been working at the gas station, who had tried to run to the store's back room but hadn't made it in time. Each funeral was a reminder that the tornado had not just destroyed buildings. It had destroyed futures. In the days after the storm, a team of meteorologists from the National Weather Service in Des Moines arrived to survey the damage. They walked the entire 43-mile path, taking measurements, photographing debris patterns, and interviewing witnesses. They found evidence of extreme wind damage, cars thrown hundreds of feet, asphalt scoured from roads, concrete slabs cracked and lifted. They classified the tornado as an EF5, the highest rating on the enhanced Fujita scale, with estimated winds of over 200 miles per hour. That rating was official confirmation of what the residents already knew. This was not just a big tornado. This was one of the most powerful storms ever recorded on the planet. The EF5 designation brought a certain grim prestige, but it also brought attention. National media descended on Parkersburg. CNN, Fox News, the Weather Channel, all of them sent reporters. They interviewed survivors, showed footage of the destruction, and talked about the resilience of small-town America. The residents were polite, but they were also tired of being a story. They wanted to rebuild, not to be analyzed. And so after a few weeks, the cameras left. The real work began. Rebuilding a town from scratch is not a simple matter of hammering nails and pouring concrete. It involves money, politics, and 1,000 small decisions that can either bring a community together or tear it apart. The city council, under the leadership of Mayor Gary Bender, had to decide where to start. The first priority was the infrastructure: water lines, sewer lines, power lines. The second priority was housing. But the third priority, and perhaps the most symbolic, was the high school. The Parkersburg High School building was gone. Hundreds of students had to be bused to neighboring districts for the remainder of the school year. But come fall, they would need a place to learn. And the town had to decide whether to rebuild on the same site, which was vulnerable and flat, or to build somewhere else, which would cost more and take longer. The debate over the high school became a microcosm of the entire recovery process. Some people wanted to rebuild exactly where it had been, to prove that the tornado could not change their way of life. Others wanted to move it to higher ground, to be safer next time. The argument went on for months. In the end, they decided to rebuild on the same site, but with a fortified tornado shelter built into the design. The new high school would have safe rooms large enough to hold every student and staff member. It would also have reinforced walls and a roof designed to withstand winds of over 200 miles per hour. It was a statement: we will not be defeated, but we will also not be foolish. Other businesses faced similar decisions. The grocery store had been flattened. The owner, a man named Carl, had no insurance. He had been running the store for 20 years and he had poured every penny back into it. Now he was 63 years old and had nothing. He stood in the empty lot where his store had been and looked at the piles of twisted metal and shattered glass. He did not know what to do. Then a local farmer came up to him and handed him an envelope. Inside was $5,000 in cash. The farmer said, "You've always given credit to my family when times were hard. Now it's my turn," Carl cried. He decided to rebuild. The new store opened 18 months later, smaller but more modern. The first day, the line stretched out the door. People came not just to buy groceries, but to show that they remembered. The recovery was not just about buildings. It was about healing wounds that could not be seen. Post-traumatic stress disorder affected many survivors. They had trouble sleeping. They jumped at loud noises. They had nightmares of the roar. A group of mental health professionals from the University of Iowa came to Parkersburg to offer free counseling sessions. At first, only a few people showed up. But as the weeks passed, more and more came. They sat in a small church basement and talked about what they had seen and heard and felt. They talked about the guilt of surviving when others had not. They talked about the anger, the sadness, the numbness. And slowly they began to heal. One of the most powerful moments came when a woman named Susan stood up in one of those sessions and said, "I never thought I would say this, but I am grateful. I am grateful that my children are alive. I am grateful that we had a basement. I am grateful that the tornado came on a Sunday when many people were home and could take shelter. If it had come during the school day, hundreds of children would have died." I know that sounds terrible, to be grateful for the timing of a disaster. But I am, and I think that is what we have to hold on to, the small mercies. Those small mercies were everywhere. The family that had lost their house but found their dog alive 3 days later hiding in a culvert. The elderly couple who had lost their home but discovered that their wedding album had been blown into a neighbor's yard, intact. The little girl who had lost her favorite stuffed rabbit, only to have it returned by a stranger who found it hanging from a tree. These moments, tiny and fragile, were the threads that held the community together. As summer turned to fall, Parkersburg began to look less like a disaster zone and more like a construction site. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the sound of sirens. Volunteers from across the country came to help. They came from church groups, from college fraternities, from Amish communities, from Mennonite relief organizations. They slept in tents and worked from dawn to dusk. They built houses, repaired roofs, and cleared debris. And they left behind not just buildings, but friendships. Many of the volunteers stayed in touch with the families they had helped. Some even came back for the one-year anniversary of the storm to see how the town was doing. The one-year anniversary fell on May 25, 2009. It was a Monday. The weather was clear and warm. The town held a memorial service in a park that had been replanted with new trees. There were speeches, a moment of silence at 5:15 p.m., the exact time the tornado had struck, and a release of white doves. The doves circled once and then flew southeast toward New Hartford. Some people cried, some people smiled, most people did both. The high school band played the national anthem, the choir sang Amazing Grace. And then when the ceremony was over, people went back to work, because that is the story of Parkersburg. It is not a story of a tornado. It is a story of a community that refused to be defined by a disaster. It is a story of people who saw the worst that nature could offer and decided that the only way to respond was to be better. They rebuilt their homes. They rebuilt their schools. They rebuilt their churches. But more than that, they rebuilt their sense of belonging. They learned that a town is not made of bricks and mortar. It is made of the people who look out for each other, who show up when the sirens sound, who pick up the pieces and start again. And so, on that warm May evening in 2009, as the sun set over the new houses and the fresh lawns, the people of Parkersburg looked to the future. They knew that another tornado could come. They knew that they could not control the wind, but they also knew that they could control how they responded. And they had already proven that they knew how to stand up to help each other and to keep going. That is the truest testament to the human spirit. In the years that followed, Parkersburg would become a model for disaster recovery. Emergency managers from across the country studied the town's response. The safe rooms in the new high school became a national standard. The neighbor-to-neighbor volunteer network was replicated in other communities. And the stories of Larry and Jenny and Martha and Ryan and David and Susan became part of the town's shared memory. They were not just stories of loss. They were stories of love, of hope, of the quiet heroism that ordinary people show when they are called upon to do extraordinary things. Today, if you drive through Parkersburg, you will see a thriving town. There are new homes, new businesses, and a sense of pride that is almost palpable. The scars are still there if you know where to look. A slight dip in the landscape where a house once stood. A commemorative plaque near the high school. The way some people still glance at the sky on a cloudy spring day. But the town is alive. It is alive because the people chose to make it so. And that choice made in the rubble of a Sunday afternoon is the real story of the Parkersburg-New Hartford tornado. It is the story of a community that, when everything was taken away, discovered the strength to build it all back again. But the story does not end with that warm May evening. The recovery from a tornado is not a straight line. It is a spiral, where the same themes of grief and gratitude, of loss and rebuilding return again and again, each time at a slightly higher vantage point. In the years that followed, the people of Parkersburg and New Hartford learned that healing is not a destination. It is a process, and the process never truly ends. One of the less visible but most profound changes was the way the tornado reshaped the town's relationship with the sky. Before the storm, people in Parkersburg paid little attention to weather forecasts. They might glance at the sky before a picnic, but they did not live in fear of clouds. After the storm, that changed. Every spring, when the air turned warm and humid, a collective anxiety settled over the town. People checked their phones obsessively. They watched the weather radar like a hawk. They had plans for where to go if the sirens sounded. And they taught their children from the youngest age exactly what to do when they heard that awful wail. This new vigilance saved lives in the years that followed. In 2010, a year after the anniversary, a severe thunderstorm warning turned into a tornado warning for the area. The sirens went off at 3 in the afternoon. People did not hesitate. They grabbed their children and their go-bags and headed for basements and safe rooms. That tornado touched down just outside of town, destroying a few outbuildings but causing no injuries. The people of Parkersburg knew what to do because they had learned the hard way. The tornado of 2008 had become a teacher, and its lessons were etched into the memory of every person who had lived through it, but not everyone stayed. In the months and years after the storm, a number of families left Parkersburg. Some could not bear to live with the memories. Others had lost their livelihoods and found work elsewhere. For a town of just over 2,000 people, every departure was a small wound. The population dropped by about 5% in the first year after the tornado, but it did not drop further. The people who stayed were the ones who were determined to make the town work, and new families moved in, attracted by the affordable housing and the sense of community. They were drawn by the stories they had heard, stories of neighbors helping neighbors, of a town that had faced the worst and come back stronger. One of those new families was the Millers. They moved to Parkersburg in 2011 from a suburb of Des Moines. They had 2 young boys, ages 7 and 9. The father, Tom, had been laid off from his job at a factory, and he had heard that Parkersburg was offering incentives for new homebuyers. He and his wife Lisa drove out to look at houses. They saw the new subdivisions, the rebuilt downtown, the shining high school. They met people at the grocery store who smiled and asked their names. They felt something they had not felt in years, a sense of belonging. They bought a house on a street where every home had been destroyed 3 years earlier. When they told their friends and family where they were moving, some were horrified. Are you crazy? A tornado hit that town. What if another one comes? But Tom and Lisa did not see a place of danger. They saw a place of resilience. And on the day they moved in, a neighbor brought them a casserole and a plate of cookies. That neighbor had lost her own house in the tornado, and now she was welcoming strangers into the rebuilt community. That was the spirit of Parkersburg. The Miller boys grew up in that house. They knew the story of the tornado by heart. They heard it in school, in the church, from the elderly couple down the street who still had a video of the aftermath. The tornado became part of their identity, but it was not a scary story. It was a story of courage. When the boys asked their mother if they should be afraid of storms, she told them no, you should be prepared. And you should remember that this town knows how to take care of each other. That lesson stuck. In New Hartford, the recovery was slower and quieter. The town was even smaller than Parkersburg, and it did not have the same resources. The industrial park that had been destroyed was never rebuilt. The businesses that had been there moved away or closed permanently. New Hartford lost about a third of its population in the years after the tornado. The people who remained were mostly older, the young people having left for bigger cities, but the town did not die. The grain elevator still stood, a silent sentinel against the sky. The church that had been destroyed was rebuilt as a smaller, more modest structure, with a basement that doubled as a community shelter. The post office reopened. And the families that stayed formed a tight bond that outsiders could not understand. They had survived something terrible together, and that shared experience was both a burden and a gift. One of the most poignant stories from New Hartford involved a man named Harold. He was in his 70s, a widower who had lived alone in a small house on the edge of town. When the tornado came, his house was ripped from its foundation and carried 200 feet. Harold was inside, clinging to a support beam. He was thrown free as the house disintegrated, landing in a ditch. He broke several ribs in his left arm, but he survived. After the storm, he was taken to a hospital where he stayed for 2 weeks. When he was released, he had nowhere to go. His house was gone. His children lived in other states and begged him to come live with them, but Harold refused. "This is my home," he said. "I have lived in New Hartford for 50 years. I am not leaving." A local couple offered to let him stay in their basement apartment until he could find a place. He stayed there for 8 months. He used his insurance money to buy a small mobile home and placed it on the same lot where his house had stood. He planted a garden. He went to church every Sunday. He became the unofficial historian of the town, telling visitors about the tornado and about the old days. He lived to be 92, and when he died, his obituary mentioned the tornado as a defining event of his life. The town held a memorial service for him, and the preacher spoke of how Harold had shown them all what it meant to hold on. The mental health effects of the tornado rippled out for years. The free counseling sessions organized by the University of Iowa continued for 5 years after the storm. They evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing support groups. People who had never spoken about their feelings found themselves sharing with strangers who understood. A group of women started a journaling club where they wrote down their memories of the tornado and how they were coping. Some of those journals were later collected into a book, published by a small local press. The book sold out in a week. Copies were passed from hand to hand, read aloud at community gatherings. It became a way for the town to process its collective trauma, to put words to the unspeakable. One of the most difficult aspects of the long-term recovery was the way the tornado had scattered families across the landscape. People who had lived next door to each other for decades were now living in temporary housing, in different neighborhoods, or in different towns entirely. The sense of place was disrupted. Children who had walked to school with the same friends every day were now being bused to new schools, or they had moved away. The elementary school in Parkersburg worked hard to help students adjust. Teachers were trained to recognize signs of trauma. Counselors were brought in. The school held regular meetings for parents, offering tips on how to talk to children about the storm. And the children, for their part, showed a resilience that amazed the adults. They drew pictures of tornadoes. They built houses out of blocks and then knocked them down and rebuilt them. They reenacted the storm in their play, giving themselves the power to control the wind. It was their way of making sense of a world that had suddenly become terrifying. As the years passed, the town found new ways to honor what had happened and to move forward. An annual fundraiser was started, called the Parkersburg Strong 5K. It took place every May, along a route that wound through the rebuilt neighborhoods. Runners and walkers passed by the high school, the new houses, the empty lots that were now community gardens. The money raised went to a scholarship fund for local students. It was a way to turn the memory of the storm into an investment in the future. Every year, the weather on race day was perfect. The people of Parkersburg liked to joke that the tornado had used up all the bad weather for the region. The 10-year anniversary in 2018 was a major event. The town had grown and changed. There were new stores, a new library, a new park with a playground that had been designed by the children in the community. The high school had graduated its first class of students who had been born after the tornado. For them, the storm was history, not memory, but they still felt its weight. The school held a special assembly on the day of the anniversary. They showed a video made up of home footage and news clips. The students watched in silence as they saw the destruction, the rescue efforts, the faces of the survivors. Some of their parents were in the video, younger, more frightened. At the end of the assembly, the principal asked the students to stand if they had a family member who had been affected by the tornado. Every single student stood up. That was the legacy of the storm. It had touched everyone. The memorial service that evening was held in the new park under a large tent. There were more than 1,000 people there, including many who had moved away but came back for the occasion. The governor spoke. The mayor spoke. And then a woman named Jenny, who had lost her house and her husband on that day, walked to the podium. She was now in her 70s, gray-haired but with a steady voice. She said, "10 years ago, I thought my life was over. I did not think I could go on, but I did not go on alone. Everyone in this town carried me. They brought me food. They held my hand. They let me cry. And today, I look around and I see this beautiful town, and I see my grandchildren playing in this park, and I know that love is stronger than any wind. That is what I want you to remember. Not the roar of the tornado, but the roar of the people who came together." The crowd applauded. The sun set behind the new trees, and as darkness fell, the town released lanterns into the sky, one for each life lost. The lanterns floated upward like small stars and then drifted away on the breeze. It was a moment of peace, of closure, of hope. In the years that followed, Parkersburg continued to thrive. It became a destination for disaster researchers, for journalists, for filmmakers. Documentaries were made, books were written. The town was held up as an example of what a community could achieve. And through it all, the people remained humble. They did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as ordinary people who had done what needed to be done. The story of the Parkersburg-New Hartford tornado is not unique. Tornadoes happen every year in every part of the country. Communities are destroyed, lives are lost. And in many cases, the recovery is slow, incomplete, and painful. But there is something about this particular story that resonates. Perhaps it is the size of the town, small enough that everyone knew everyone. Perhaps it is the way the community responded, with an almost immediate, instinctive generosity. Or perhaps it is the simple fact that the people of Parkersburg and New Hartford refused to give up. They did not let the storm define them, they defined themselves. And so the legacy of the tornado is not the path of destruction it carved across the Iowa landscape. That path has healed. The fields have been replanted, the houses have been rebuilt, the scars are hidden beneath fresh grass and new paint. The legacy is the spirit that emerged from the rubble, the spirit that is still alive today. It lives in the safe rooms of the high school, in the stories told by grandparents to grandchildren, in the way a town that was nearly erased chose to write its own future. If you ever find yourself in Parkersburg, stop by the town square. There is a bench there dedicated to the memory of those who died. On the bench, a small plaque reads, "The wind can destroy what we have built, but it cannot destroy who we are." Sit on that bench for a moment. Look at the sky. And remember what it took to build this place again. That is the true story of the Parkersburg-New Hartford tornado, a story of wind and ruin. But more than that, a story of courage and community. A story that in the end is not about the storm at all. It is about the people, and the people are still here. That is the true story of the Parkersburg-New Hartford tornado, a story of wind and ruin, but more than that, a story of courage and community. A story that in the end is not about the storm at all. It is about the people, and the people are still here. But to truly understand the depth of that story, you have to look beyond the anniversaries and the memorials. You have to look at the quiet moments that never made the news. The moments that happened in living rooms and kitchens, in the dark hours of the night when the town was asleep and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant whistle of a train on the tracks. Those were the moments when the real recovery took place. There was a man named Bill who lived on the outskirts of Parkersburg. He had been a farmer his whole life, a man of few words and calloused hands. When the tornado hit, it took his barn, his equipment, and a dozen of his cattle. He had been in the house with his wife, huddled in the basement, listening to the roar. When they came up, the world was transformed. The fields that had been ready for harvest were now a jumble of debris. The barn was gone, reduced to a pile of splintered wood. The cattle were scattered, some dead, some wandering in a daze. Bill stood in the middle of it all and did not cry. He just stood there, silent, for a long time. In the days that followed, Bill did not talk about what he had lost. He just worked. He helped his neighbors clear debris. He drove his truck into town to deliver supplies. He showed up at the community center and helped serve meals. Everyone saw him as a pillar of strength, but at night he would sit in his living room staring at the wall, unable to sleep. His wife would bring him coffee and he would take it without a word. She knew he was struggling, but she did not know how to reach him. It was a small thing that finally broke the silence. A few weeks after the storm, a young woman from the University of Iowa came to the farm to do a survey about long-term recovery. She asked Bill questions about his losses, his needs, his plans. He answered in short sentences. And then at the end she asked him, "How are you really doing?" That simple question, asked with genuine kindness, cracked something inside him. He started talking. He talked about the cattle he had raised from calves, about the barn his father had built, about the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He talked about the fear he felt during the storm, a fear he had never admitted to anyone. He talked about the guilt he felt for surviving when so many others had lost everything. The young woman listened. She did not offer advice. She just listened. When she left, Bill felt lighter than he had in weeks. He started going to the support group at the church. He started talking to his neighbors about what they had been through. He learned that he was not alone in his pain, and that was the beginning of his healing. That is a story that does not make it into the documentaries. It is a small story, a private story, a story that happened in the quiet margins of the public narrative. But there were hundreds of such stories in Parkersburg and New Hartford. Every family had its own path through grief. Every person had their own moment of darkness and their own small act of grace that pulled them back into the light. The children, as they grew older, carried the storm with them in ways that surprised even themselves. A teenager named Megan, who had been 8 years old on the day of the tornado, wrote a college admissions essay about the experience. She described the chaos, the fear, the aftermath. But she also described the kindness of strangers who had taken her family in, the way her mother had held her hand and told her everything would be okay even when they had nothing left. She wrote about how the tornado had taught her that material things do not matter, but that people matter. That essay got her into a good university. She went on to study emergency management, determined to help other communities prepare for disasters. She said, "I want to be the person who shows up with a bottle of water and a kind word. That is what I remember most." Another young man named Derek, who was a senior in high school during the tornado, decided to become a carpenter. He had helped rebuild houses in the months after the storm, working alongside professional builders who had come from other states. He discovered that he loved the work, the precision of it, the satisfaction of turning a pile of lumber into a home. He apprenticed with a contractor and eventually started his own business. He specialized in building safe rooms, the kind that had saved so many lives in Parkersburg. He would tell his customers, "I build these because I know what it is like to be inside one when the world is ending." He charged fair prices and often donated his labor for families who could not afford the cost. He said it was his way of paying back the town that had raised him. The town itself continued to evolve. The new houses were built to stricter codes with reinforced roofs and impact-resistant windows. The trees that were planted along the streets were chosen for their deep roots and flexibility, species that could bend in the wind without breaking. There was a deliberate effort to build back not just stronger but smarter. The community learned from the disaster. They became experts in tornado safety. They held workshops for neighboring towns, sharing their knowledge. They lobbied the state government for better warning systems and more funding for safe rooms. Their voice carried weight because they had lived through the worst. And yet, for all the progress, there were still shadows. Some people could not let go of the fear. An older woman named Ruth, who had lived in Parkersburg her entire life, developed a severe anxiety disorder after the storm. Every time the sky turned gray, she would start to shake. She would go into her basement and stay there until the weather cleared, even if it was just a passing shower. Her family tried to help her, but she could not be reasoned with. She had seen the sky turn green, had heard the freight train sound, and her body remembered what her mind could not control. She became a recluse, rarely leaving her house. The community rallied around her. Neighbors would check on her before storms. The local church arranged for a volunteer to sit with her during severe weather warnings. She never fully recovered, but she was never abandoned. The town understood that some wounds do not heal completely. They learned to live with the scars. The story of the Parkersburg-New Hartford tornado is also a story about the passage of time. As the years went by, the memory of the storm began to fade for some, but it stayed vivid for others. The children who had experienced it became adults, and they told their own children about the day the world changed. Those children grew up hearing the story, and they became the custodians of the memory. In 2028, on the 20th anniversary, another ceremony was held. Many of the original survivors were now elderly or had passed away. But their children and grandchildren were there, holding photographs, lighting candles. The town had changed again. There were new businesses, new housing developments, a new generation of families who had moved in after the storm. For them, the tornado was a footnote in the town's history, a story they had heard but not lived. But they participated in the anniversary anyway because they understood that to be part of a community is to honor its past. One of the speakers at that 20th anniversary was a young woman named Lily, who had been born 6 months after the tornado. She was a student at the high school, and she had studied the event as part of a local history project. She interviewed survivors, collected photographs, and wrote a paper that was later published in the town's Historical Society newsletter. At the ceremony, she read from her paper. She said, "I was not there. I did not feel the wind. I did not hear the roar, but I have seen the pictures. I have read the letters. I have listened to the stories. And I want you to know that I carry this memory with me, even though it is not my own. It is my town's memory. It is my family's memory. It is the memory of a people who refuse to be broken, and I am proud to be part of that people." The crowd was silent, and then they applauded, not because Lily had said anything profound, but because she had said the exact thing that needed to be said. The memory was safe. It would be passed on. The storm would never be forgotten, but it would also never be the only thing that defined the town. The town had so many other stories now, stories of births and weddings and graduations, stories of new buildings and new friendships, stories of quiet evenings and ordinary days. The tornado had been a chapter, a powerful one, but the book continued. In the end, that is the most important lesson of all. Disasters can destroy houses and highways. They can tear apart families and scatter communities, but they cannot kill the human spirit. That spirit, that stubborn, irrational, beautiful determination to keep going, to rebuild, to love, to laugh, to hope, that is what survives. That is what Parkersburg and New Hartford taught us. And that is what we must remember, not just in the face of tornadoes, but in the face of any storm, any loss, any tragedy. We are not defined by the wind. We are defined by what we do after the wind stops. So as the lanterns floated into the sky on that 20th anniversary, and as the crowd stood in silence watching them rise, it was not a moment of sorrow. It was a moment of gratitude. Gratitude for the lives that had been saved, for the community that had been rebuilt, for the love that had never wavered. The lanterns drifted higher and higher until they were indistinguishable from the stars. And the people of Parkersburg and New Hartford looked up and they smiled. They knew that the wind could come again, but they also knew that they were ready. They had the tools, the knowledge, the support, and most importantly, they had each other. And that was enough. That would always be enough.